an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Wall of Storms, chapters 46, 47, and 48. Prince and Princess of Ukyu, Mapidare's Expedition, and Viliuku and Aegon. In these chapters, it appears that our friend Luan Zia is making a similar mistake as the one Master Ruthie, I believe it was, made. And what's so tragic about it is that it is a mistake born of compassion and education. And I hate watching him do this. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. Yeah, guys, so I really didn't think that we were going to go this far into what happens to Luan Zia and still not have reached the point where he gets mutilated. And the fact that it's taking this long is absolutely excruciating. Like, the dread that has built up in me, knowing it's coming, and it's just, it's killing me. And the way that this goes off initially is it's really, really well done, because it makes you understand why Luan Zia might have made some of the mistakes that he has made. It's a real testament to how good the Pekyu is at manipulation. He really understands how some of these people work and the way they think and see other people. And he is leveraging that in a way that is very ruthless and upsetting. You know, when you are somebody who knows the goodness that Luan Zia intends, and you watch him getting manipulated like this, it's really tough, because I can't say that if I were in his position, I wouldn't do the same thing. There's a couple things going on here, and one of them is obviously curiosity about a new race of people and wanting to have a kind of it's a combination, I think, of wanting to be treated well, and so being cooperative will ensure that you are treated well, or at least he thinks, and that's been working out so far. And also wanting to believe something is true. And that's particularly poisonous. Wanting to believe something is a huge influence on the way we go about every day of our lives. Having faith in something, whether it has proven to be or seems to be proven, doesn't even need to be. If it's just giving the appearance of being something that we wish it was, we will continue to operate as if it is that way, because there's I think, a flicker in us all that if we keep acting as if it is what we hope it is, it will somehow turn into that, whether it is started off that way or not. We're hoping that we can somehow create the reality that we want. And to a degree, I think that's a completely respectable way to live your life. You have to have hope, and you have to have faith to not simply despair all the time. You know what I mean? So I'm not even mad about that as a principle. But man, when you see somebody like this who is in a position where he has really got no alternative, it's not just, well, I want to believe these people that live next door to me mean well, And so I'm going to believe they mean well, even though I could just choose to no longer associate with them anymore. He doesn't have that. He's basically given two options: cooperate and trust the goodwill of these people despite the flickers of doubt you have, or do not cooperate and then bear the consequences of that, whatever that might be, whether it is being executed, being imprisoned, being tortured, as we find out later. So really, I can't be too mad at him for going down the road he does. I mean, he really, it's different. I said that he's making a similar mistake to Master Ruthie. And if I'm picking the wrong name, I think it was Master Ruthie though, let me know. But Master Ruthie walked into this settlement, this camp, gave up his weapons voluntarily and put himself into a situation that he did not need to, because he continued to have faith, all the while being given the option to protect himself. Luan Zia doesn't have that kind of alternative. Master Ruthie could have walked away. So there was a part of him that I think was also speaking from compassion and from being educated enough to know that other cultures are going to be different from yours and not wanting to be too judgmental. But there was also a part of him that seemed to just all he did was just underestimate them, not believe that they were capable of hurting him. It seemed like Luan Zia isn't making that kind of mistake. He knows that they are definitely capable. He can see what it is they're working with here. But again, he is very much at their mercy. It's not like he can get away, you know? So this woman comes into this, we find out he's essentially in a cage and is feeding him. And when he wakes up, he's vomiting, and it says he could feel that he had soiled himself. And when he woke up again, he felt even weaker, but his stomach had finally settled. So initially I thought maybe what they gave him was somehow poisonous, but I believe that it was him getting fed something that was like dairy and fermented after going so long without proper nutrition. I think maybe his body simply just had this reaction. So I have a long history of having an eating disorder, basically. And there was a period where I did the Master Cleanse. I don't know if anyone listening has heard of that. But the Master Cleanse was made pretty famous by Beyonce at one point. Other celebrities have done it. And it's essentially supposed to be a cleanse by fasting from solid food and drinking a mixture of lemon juice, grade B maple syrup, and cayenne pepper. And this is supposed to give you all of the nutrients that you need for 10 straight days so that you don't suffer and pass out, but your body works overtime, allegedly, because it's not focusing on your digestion to clean out other organs and it's bullshit. Cleanses are not real, just FYI. But I bought it back then. I thought it was true. And I did the full 10 days of no eating and drinking only this thing. Now, at the end of the 10 days, you are meant to ease yourself back into solid food by making a vegetable broth and then eventually eating some of the vegetables that were in that broth, and then working in some grains into the broth with the vegetables and slowly get yourself back into solid food. I did not do that. I made myself a big potato vegetable stew with grains and I think quinoa and stuff in it, and finished my 10 days and had this big bowl, and woke up that night in some of the worst pain of my entire life and collapsed on the bathroom floor screaming, pretty much certain that I was rupturing internally and going to die. So not eating the way you're meant to for an extended period, it really fucks with your whole internal mechanism. I mean, this is something that was documented with victims of the Holocaust when, the soldiers found them and fed them. They did not realize the damage that could be done to starving people who ate their fill all of a sudden. And there were some people who died due to the suddenness of getting this food. So once I sort of stepped back from this, I was like, oh, I think that's what happened because, I know what happens to Luan Zia. So the idea that maybe they poisoned him wasn't out of the question for me initially. I didn't really understand why they would need to because he was already so weak, but it wasn't something that I was ready to just dismiss out of hand. But now I'm like, oh, you know what? They tried to give him something very nourishing because they could see that he was starving. And then that turned out to be a little bit too much. So yeah, they give him a little bit of soup and stew and gradually begins to they begin to add some more things to the meals. He's listening, meanwhile, to these people around him talking and hears them say the word Dara, he thinks. And he has no idea how they can know about Dara, but he falls asleep again before he can ask. When he wakes up, he's on the back of a fucking dragon. Luan Zia, if it were anyone else, I'd be like, he must have been absolutely terrified. And he is obviously really, I don't want to say alarmed, but he is taken aback by it. But he is such a discoverer and enjoys the newness of things so much that there's very little time spent on him being afraid. It's more him observing everything. He's looking at his own situation that he is in a cage and his feet are tied to the bars of the prison. He's paying attention to the animal whose back he's on. And he's looking at this creature and thinking that it seems familiar. And then says they looked exactly like the strange winged and antlered beasts he had seen on the wreckage pieces that had inspired his voyage. His heart pounded with the thrill of discovery, of having stepped through a dream into a new world. And I'm just like, oh, yeah. Of course. He's here, tied and imprisoned in a cage. But all he can think about is, oh, this is so exciting. And I'm just like, Luan Zia, dude, come on. Have a little bit of a sense of self-preservation here, buddy. Jesus Christ. But, honestly, I guess his attitude is the best case scenario. If you're going to be going through something like this, better to be excited and full of wonder than just fucking flat out terrified, I suppose. Let's see. So he's talking about the landscape that he can see below him. And it says, endless, flat, and tan, dotted with clumps of brush and grass. Herds of animals, they resembled cattle, but far shaggier and somewhat bigger, roamed beneath him. And each herd was accompanied by 2 or 3 beasts like the one he rode on. They waddled alongside the herds, their wings folded, carrying herdsmen who looked up at his mount as it flew overhead. Far in the distance, he saw the slate-gray ocean, dotted here and there with a few of the small bowl-shaped grass ships bobbing over the waves. And there are guards all around him, and they all sort of notice that he is awake and look at him, and he tries to talk to them, but nobody actually replies, even though he's starting to have a suspicion that some of them might actually know his language. And once I saw what the landscape here was like, because, obviously we're hearing stories about how their god is called the All-Father, which is, another name for Odin in our universe, they are described as being white and having like blonde hair. So there was a, immediate comparison that I made to Vikings. But as I got to like further into the history in the later chapter, the Liuku and Aegon, I started to realize that this felt a little bit more like the Mongols. Like there's a real kind of, the description of the land reminds me of the steppes. And of course, the Pekyu, what's his name? I've forgotten his name now. Shit. But we'll get there. Reminds me of the other guy whose name I forget. Fuck. I'm so bad at this today, guys. I am not on my game. Y'all know who I mean. The one who's like, basically DNA is up and down the fucking coast of China because he raped so many women. I was just really, there was something about the organization and the ferocity of not only his own sort of like bloodlust and desire to control and dominate, but also the loyalty that he seemed to inspire felt familiar. Kyle says their Chinese historical equivalent are the Xiongnu. I hope I'm saying that right. Sort of pre-Mongol Mongols. Interesting. Forgive me. I'm about to Google them because I am just super curious of like how you say that word. But I think that is, let's see, we're a tribal confederation of nomadic peoples who, according to ancient Chinese sources, inhabited the eastern Eurasian steppe from the 3rd century BC to the late 1st century AD. Okay, there's some pretty amazing illustrations. Awesome. Yeah, okay. This makes sense. And that would sort of have, like, because if you go northwest, I mean, them having a similar god or a god that, like, reflects a little bit what the Vikings worshipped, things like spread in that way, and it would really make a lot of sense. Anyway, this is just really, really interesting, but I'm getting ahead of myself because we don't find out about that story until later. So it takes a long time. The travel, like he gets off the first dragon and is transferred to another after about an hour. And this happens 12 times. And they, it's a pretty amazing thing to ride on the back of one of these creatures, but having to change out 12 times is a pretty clear indication that they get tired really quickly. And this is a long journey, evidently. So where he turns up and the fact that he gets brought all the way to where he does, that indicates that, it's a 12-hour ride and he is still in the land, like 12 hours away. He was still on the territory of the people that he winds up talking to, which just gives you an idea of how huge their territory is. The flying beast landed, and Luan saw that in front of the tent was a tall bone pole from whose crown several furry long tails flapped like banners. Luan was shocked to see 2 metal helmets, the first signs of metal he had seen anywhere in this new land, and also dangling and flapping from the tip of the flagpole. They were familiar to him, being constructed in the style of the old Zana Empire, and he could see that inside the helmets were the mummified remains of 2 heads. Something writhed in the depths of Luan Zia's mind, the beginning of a vague answer that could explain some of the riddles around him. So he gets brought to this little hut, and it's like a kind of nicer cell. I mean, it's not really secure particularly, but there are guards stationed around it. And there is a pile of furs. There's like a chamber pot. And there's all the kinds of things that he could use to build a fire. And as the days go on, he's given food and recognizes that he is being given food that is likely the same as the rest of the community is being fed, which indicates that he is not being mistreated in any way. And that kind of makes him feel a little bit better. But then finally, on the 5th day, he gets, the door is opened and there are 2 people standing outside, both about 20, a man and a woman. The quality of the furs they wore and the delicate bone and teeth jewels they wore in their hair told Luan that they were nobles. And they are kneeling in Miparari, which is, specific to Dara. And he's like, oh shit, and also kneels. And he says his name, and they reply with, forgive us, honored master. And I loved that Luan's reaction to this is to just tear up. I don't think if you have never lived somewhere that people don't speak your language, there is any way to get across how incredibly isolating it is. And this is one of those things that people who, berate and talk shit in general about immigrants, they sound so ignorant for such a variety of reasons. But the biggest one for me is you are so much less brave than this person who has chosen to take this risk, and you're out here acting like you have something to be indignant about. And you should be hugely respectful of this person for doing something that takes a lot of balls. Moving somewhere where you don't speak the language and are either in the middle of learning it or you have learned just enough to get by is really overwhelming. I've talked about time that I spent in Guatemala, and I was there for like a month and a half and gradually really got much more fluent in Spanish. But initially I came down with like a group of other students, and we were each separated into our own homestay. And when I realized that we were going to be separated like that, which I don't think I quite comprehended, I think I thought we would be separated and there would be like 2 of us per house. I didn't realize that each one of us was getting put into a different house. The panic I felt at realizing that I was going to be placed in a situation where there was nobody that knew English and nobody that I could fall back on talking to, that was terrifying. And granted, it forces you to learn the language or else just not get anything that you need or want. But it also emphasizes how much, like, how comforting being able to communicate in this quick and easy way is, and how much you take that for granted on the daily because you just don't have to think about it. And I really wish everybody had a chance to go through that so that they could have a better appreciation for like the sacrifice of leaving behind your family or your friends and your life to go to a new country because you think it will be better for your family or your friends or yourself. And that sacrifice of leaving things behind is difficult enough if you are moving from one part of the United States to another and you speak English in both areas. Moving from another country and giving up all that as well as giving up your language. I mean, there is just, I really cannot emphasize enough how much I understand bursting into tears at the sound of somebody speaking the language that you can speak after a prolonged period of like first thinking he's going to die and then not knowing what the fuck is going to happen and having no idea. And even if they wanted to tell him, knowing that they probably wouldn't really be able to express that. This was kind of touching. So they tell him this story, and this is something that, to Luan Zia's credit, he is very suspicious of. The girl says, "We apologize for the terrible way you've been treated. We didn't know that you were an honored guest from Dara." And he says, how do you know about Dara, etc.? And they said it might be easier to show you than tell you. So he gets put into a saddle instead of into a cage this time, and gets carried over the ships in the harbor that are the city ships that Dara had built. Now, I know that they show up on these city ships. I don't feel like I remembered that they were the same city ships. And I might have mentioned this in another section because it rang a bell, but I feel like it didn't like sink in the first time or something. But yeah, 20 massive ships, each as big as a small city. They were fitting tributes to the memory of a man who had dreamed of connecting the islands of Dara with tunnels under the sea, and whose projects were all monumental in scale, almost beyond mortal comprehension. Accurate. And Vaju told him a story that had changed her world. She says that they arrived more than 20 years ago, before she was even born. And the visitors showed Liuku how narrow their world had been, how devoid of all the joys and refinements associated with high civilization, machinery, art, literature, manners, true beauty. I really liked this, and this is something that I have mentioned before, just the sort of like Eurocentric view that colonizers had of thinking that like England was the pinnacle of civilization and everything else was barbaric and behind, when in fact England was the one that was behind. England, in comparison to, you know, areas in the Mideast, was so far behind on technology and art. And it's really amazing to see how behind they were, and then realize that they wound up like subjugating half the world. It just goes to show civilization, education, and refinement are not necessary. Only brute force is necessary. And unfortunately, they apparently had that. As do these people, the Liuku. The people of Dara were excellent teachers, and the Liuku and their honored guests lived in harmony for many years. But then one day, a calamity struck. All the visitors of Dara fell sick, and every one of them died within a few days. There you can see the graves, and she points them out, and there's neat rows of thousands of grave markers made of bone. And each one was the size of a small hut in Dara. He was struck silent by the sight. What horror Vaju and her people must have experienced. And he's looking at this and he's like, you know, she says something about Father vowed to find a way to honor their final wishes and have their bodies interred in the soil of their homeland. And Luan at first is very appreciative of this suggestion, because the people of Dara believe that if you are not buried in the land of your birth, your spirit will not find rest. You won't be able to like cross that river. But Luan notices that all of the grave markers are so uniform in size and shape, and also in where it appears. And it says, would a mass cemetery built in response to an unexpected plague look so neat, so new? And this is, you know, she's saying that this happened years ago, but he's saying it looks new. And I assume that like in the air, maybe he can't exactly see what this is. Maybe it's not even a cemetery at all. Like it could be anything. And his suspicion, I mean, this keeps coming up, this feeling of like, this doesn't feel right. But he doesn't have any solid evidence to back up his suspicions with. Let's see. We honor the people of Dara in every way we can. Admiral Krita, who led the expedition to these shores, still watches over us, as do the eyes of his wife, a Liuku woman who fell in love with him. We have preserved their heads after the custom of our people, and they are displayed at the top of the flagstaff in front of the grand tent of Tayton. And Luan's like, okay, yeah, I did see those heads. And if that is what you intended, I guess. But he's got this idea of what it actually looked like. That it seemed much more a warning. There wasn't a feeling of like, oh yeah, they were preserved to honor them. They were displayed in a way that did not seem to hold a lot of respect. It seemed to be much more threatening. So that is something that I am extremely glad he is like taking note of, despite the fact that he immediately doubts his own judgment there. I just need Luan Zia to at least see the difference between what she's saying and the way it appears to be executed, pun intended. But maybe he was just being too narrow-minded. The people of Liku had their own cultures and customs, and he warned himself not to force his own preconceived ideas onto a new world. Which, again, this is what happens when you are somebody who is educated, and you know that there are different ways of life that deserve respect. You want to give them the room to be what they are, while at the same time having to be conscious of the threat that they might pose. And the difference is Luan Zia is somebody who likes to discover and observe. He is not interested in subjugating people. That he's not a conqueror. So he doesn't think of these things the way he maybe should were he of that mindset, in order to get an idea of the ways that he could be being played. And he's like still kind of aware that he might be being played, and he's trying to be careful, but there's really only so much he can do. So back in Taten, he is given a tent that is the one that the prince and princess shared. As they explained it, since he was clearly a learned man from Dara, he was fit to be their teacher as well and should live with them. And Kuju gives him a book called the Gitre Uthu. You must be an extremely learned man to have such a thick tome with you. We've preserved the city ships as best we are able, if only we could find a way to help guide the lost souls of the honored guests from Dara back to their home. Alas, we lack the knowledge of the master navigators of Dara. While the guests from Dara were alive, they tried to find their way home to their family many times. Father always gave them whatever help they needed, but none of the fleets they launched to find a way home ever succeeded, and some never came back, except as wreckage that washed ashore after many years. So, Luan, for his own part, it's like, this is worded as, do you have records of the expedition? He couldn't help himself. The prospect of such a puzzle was too tempting, and if he could solve the puzzle, not only would the bodies of the members of Mapidere's expedition be brought back to Dara, he would also be able to go home. And after he asks this question, the prince leaves and comes back with a pile of scrolls and volumes and maps. These are the logs left by Admiral Krita, as well as the pre-launch plans of later exploratory missions. Do you have records of when and where the wreckage of these exploratory missions were discovered? Yes. Kuju showed Luan where to look. Luan was amazed by how quickly and neatly Kuju had assembled so much material. It was as if everything had been set aside ahead of time, just waiting for him to ask for them. He shook his head. He was acting paranoid and suspicious, a bad habit from his time in Dara. This was a different land. There would be different rules. He would not insult the prince and princess who tried to honor the memory of strangers who had come across the sea and become their friends. Oh, Luan Zia. Like, again, I respect so much that he has this point of view. But he's ignoring his gut instinct, which is just never a good idea. And also, the fact that he has noticed that the helmets they have hung up are like some of the only metal that he has seen anywhere, I want him to recognize how significant that is. they have talked about, the people of Dara introducing them to things that they never knew existed. And they say it in a way that if you are a person with a big ego, you can just hear praise. All you hear is just, wow, you guys are so advanced and it's so amazing. And we would love to be able to have to be part of this. And you don't hear the greed. You don't hear the envy and desire. And Luan Zia's mind doesn't work that way. So that's not the first thing that he thinks. But I want him so bad to notice you have something they clearly don't. They want to get there to take it. It's really not that hard. But he can't resist the lure of testing his mettle against an intricate new puzzle. So it says he decided to take precautions. For days he kept himself at his task. He pored over tables of figures and scratched out computations in a tray of sand. He compared the maps from Admiral Krita's logs with the maps he had drawn. He examined Krita's observations of the Wall of Storms and matched them against his own. Yada, 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 yada. They leave him alone. They take him sightseeing around the islands, ask him about his theories and his thoughts. And Luan Zia, for his part, is actually having an amazing time. He is really enjoying, as usual, discovering new things, but also being around young, intelligent people who ask the right questions and present their own thoughts is exactly his favorite thing. That's part of what drew him to Zomi. He likes being challenged. He likes being around people who think differently than he does. This is everything that gets him off, basically. And finally, it says, one night, Luan Zia put down the bone pen he had been using to write in the tray of sand. He had solved the puzzle of how to get back to Dara. So he's really excited because obviously he's been working on this for days, and he wants to go and tell the prince and princess, but they've gone to bed already. So he decides that he's going to take a walk and clear his head, and he is allowed, I was surprised by this, to go and walk about on his own without guards following him around. And it says the prince and princess had accompanied him everywhere the past few days, and the guards now treated him with great respect, which I'm sure goes a long way towards feeling like this is the situation that they are presenting to you, that you are being treated with respect by the guards and they are not behaving suspiciously and following you, makes you feel like you must not really be a prisoner. I just kind of expected this to, for him wandering alone on his own at night, I thought that this might be the first time he tried that, and that maybe once he did, he would get a different reaction. But apparently not. So he's walking around, and he gets behind the grand tent, and he sees this mound that has a door in the side that's made out of a grid of bones. And he just gets a really bad feeling, and he doesn't know why. But he goes over to open the door. He can't see inside. He takes a step forward, and then he falls down this huge, long tunnel. And he winds up collapsing on the bottom and hears somebody down there. And he also sees some miniature Gerinifins, dragons. And they are huddled together and chained to the wall. This is so upsetting, you guys, because I had said already that it seemed like they had a great respect and a sort of symbiotic relationship with these creatures. But we wind up finding out that they are extremely intelligent. Like, we hear a story later on that there is a dragon that frames a guard for a crime because that guard was cruel to her. These things have a complex understanding and are able to understand language to a point. They are much, much smarter than I anticipated. And even if I had, I would have thought that would mean their relationship was even closer. But it appears that what is actually happening is they are being threatened into complying because parts of their family units are being held hostage, which is just such an ugly, horrifying thing. And with, you know, these animals that are completely at their mercy it's not that they're not able to defend themselves at all, but clearly they're being like outnumbered, and they have a affection for family, or else holding them hostage wouldn't work, you know? So they have like emotional bonds the same way as human beings do. And I just like finding this out hurt more than anything, honestly. So far back in the cave is Zomi's dad. And he pieces together very quickly because he recognizes the last name. And Luan tells Olga all about his daughter and everything that she has been up to and all of the like amazing shit she has done. And I really love that Olga is just like, you get out of here. There is no way. Are you serious? She did what now? And I'm like, yeah, that's the appropriate way to react because your daughter is a fucking badass, dude. So good job. So then he tells his story and talks about the storm that capsized the boat and floating around, and eventually he thinks he's drowning, but he gets saved by a sea turtle. And people think that that's a sign that Lutho is watching them and like sort of helping them out. And eventually, and this is like on the side of the storm wall that Dara is on. So he doesn't, because when I first read that the boat capsized, I assumed that that was due to the wall of storms, that they like tried to go through it or they got caught up in it, and that was when he capsized. But this happens before they even reach it, and then they get to the wall. And I was like, oh, that's how that works. He says, we sailed straight north, and the wind was so strong behind us that I would have sworn we were flying. We had no trouble until we came to the wall of storms, and we were certain we were doomed. And lots of people see this wall of storms coming and are like, fuck this, and jump off the boats because there is no stopping the boats. They are caught and they are going to this wall. But these people are like, I probably can have better luck just jumping into the water and trying to fucking survive that way. So lots of people abandon ship. But then eventually, when the boats get close enough, all of a sudden the wall parts. And the ships go straight through it, and they're fine. And he says, Admiral Krita said it was a sign that even the forces of nature had to obey the edicts of Emperor Mapidere. To which I'm like, oh man, that is just an unfortunate, like, I always hate when somebody says like, you know, the gods must bend to the will of, I'm just like, oh, don't do that. Don't say that. You're just asking for trouble now. So they get caught up in a current and brought to the shores, and he doesn't really get into what happens to them. Like how they are treated, because he sort of doubles back. He gives Luan Zia a simplified history of these people and the lands and how they live. They were nomadic. They depend on herding cattle and grazing and that kind of thing. It says tribes were small and they lived their lives always on the edge of disaster. Their survival and the survival of the herds depended on a balance between drought and flooding. Even in good times, the plains were filled with predators with sharp claws and sharper teeth. Just generally, we're given an idea of how like desperate it was to live in this world. So eventually they begin to like tame the dragons, and this leads to a huge change in the way that they interact with one another, these different tribes, because initially there had always been skirmishes and quarrels, but as they are able to tame these war monsters, the battles grow much bigger in scope, much more devastating. And it is just a lot. The conflicts begin to get bigger and bigger until we're dealing in the thousands. So for centuries, the Liuku and the Aegon were locked in a stalemate punctuated by occasional but bloody and indecisive border skirmishes. And I found it interesting that he names the people the Aegon because, like, you know, the Song of Ice and Fire series has dragons, and the characters who were sort of in charge of the dragons, there are several named Aegon. So I kept thinking of that while I was reading this. But there eventually the Aegon overpower the Liuku, and the king of the Liuku takes Tenrio Roatan as a hostage to ensure the good behavior of the Liuku. And this whole thing basically goes like in a direction that guy did not see coming, because he thinks, I'm going to take this kid, raise him as my own. He will have such affection for me and my family from being raised amongst us that he will be an ambassador on our behalf once he is allowed to see his family again, if he is at all. But his loyalty will remain to me. And we get and I'm not going to get too into this, but there comes a point where the Liuku rebel again, and the king of the Aegon is like, all right, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to execute you. And like, this really sucks. And I really have grown to care about you. And I know that my son does too, that he considers you like his best friend. But the whole point of taking you was to have you as leverage against your family so that they would not act up again. And here they are acting up, and I have to hold up my end of this deal, or else they're not going to take me seriously. Why would they listen to me? So I have to prove that I would be willing to put you to death if I have to. And there's a way in which they want to kill him that is meant to be a kinder method, because it preserves his honor in such a way that he can still go to the afterlife the way that he is meant to. Because basically, since Tenrio is not being allowed to fight back, if the gods saw him die without fighting back, and with his the sort of test of whether they can see is whether sunlight touches his blood, then he is going to be seen as weak, and the gods will not accept him into the afterlife, or at least into the version of it that he wants to be in. So what they plan to do is to wrap him in Garinifin's skin and let cattle trample over him. And this way, his blood will be hidden from sight, and the gods will not know his manner of death. So he decides to take advantage of this method and the affection of his like kind of brother, Diamon. Diamon is the one who he asks to carry out the sentence. And Diamon's father, the king, is actually kind of touched that Tenrio asked for Diamon to do it, because Diamon has never killed anyone before, and it's kind of a rite of passage. And the fact that Tenrio is offering his life to be Diamon's first kill, the king considers thoughtful and kind and generous, which is like, just, I feel so bad for this guy. I don't, because he's like obviously terrible, but like, you know. So Tenrio, you know, is apparently being really brave, but we are all aware he's getting out of this, because we know that he goes on to become Pekyu later on. And he asks for a couple of things, allegedly out of nostalgia and a desire for comfort, because he is trying to be brave in the face of death, but is a little scared. And would you get me these couple things as a token while I wait for death. And his brother, who is full of compassion and cares about this guy, is delighted to give them to him. But the two things happen to be a calf skin and a pair of horns that him and his brother like got from some hunt or whatever. And once he says that he wants these two things, my first thought is, oh, so he can look like one of the cattle and they won't trample him. And that's exactly what it is. Once he's got the calf skin over him and the horns on the outside of it, he looks like a calf laying down in the grass. And once they are sent to trample him, they pass around him rather than over him, and they don't harm him. Diamon has to check to make sure he's dead, and comes down on his dragon and opens the wrapper, or he starts to, and Tenryo jumps out and stabs him in the throat with a dagger. And it happens so fast that all of the guards, like, they do not have time to react. And Tenryo takes his weapon, which is like a ancestral weapon. It's something that has been handed down, climbs onto his sort of brother's dragon and flies off. And his brother's dragon's name was Kidia. And Kidia is the one that I mentioned earlier, who we find out frames a guard, because that guard was kind of like a sadist and really mistreated the Garina and was in particular guarded over her. And it's clear that she holds a grudge, and she behaves like a very docile, like, creature to make them think that she's weak, when in fact she is burning with the desire for vengeance and hatred and everything. And Tenryo feels the exact same way and can tell that they are going to be really good allies. But it doesn't go the way Kidia thinks, because eventually Tenryo turns on her and uses her as a means to get the loyalty of his men to be absolute. And it's really terrible. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it's really not that big a deal, because Tenryo basically, he takes this king down, or he takes this king's son down. He escapes. He goes back to his home. His father, who had allowed him to be taken as a hostage, doesn't even really like Tenryo that much, and has lots of kids, and is not really like, it's basically Tenryo has proven that he deserves to come home, but he's not treated as a favored son. He has not distinguished himself enough to be elevated past the position that he had been when he was taken. And so he's sort of left to his own devices, because they expect him to do the same sort of harmless things that the other sons and daughters do. But he has a very particular objective in mind. So what he does is essentially invents the idea of a standing army. His opinion is that if there are people out there who are capable of fighting, they should constantly be in training for fighting, because we know that these like skirmishes are going to happen, and they should not be spending their time herding cattle and wasting their energy and their efforts doing something that literally anybody could do, when they could be improving their fighting skills and helping overcome enemies. And it starts off like initially people are really resistant to the idea of just becoming professional soldiers. Like the idea of this is so outside of anything that they have done before that he has to kind of explain himself a few times, and gradually like just uses his force of will to like shut people up by, doing battle with them. And Tenryo taught the pilots to guide their mounts to fly in formation, to compensate for each other's blind spots, and to reserve fire so that the Garinafins could unleash their limited fire breath in coordinated volleys for maximal damage. As well, he standardized the war parties riding on the backs of the Garrinafins. Instead of the haphazard collection of riders mostly taken from members of the same family who fought with whatever weapons they found convenient, each Garrinafin would have a crew between 6 and 2 dozen. Besides the pilot, there would be lookouts responsible for paying attention behind and to the sides, shield men responsible for protecting the pilot, and warriors with slingshots and war clubs who would focus on attacking the pilots of enemy Garrinafins from a distance or leaping across onto other Garrinafins at close range to engage in melee warfare. So this dude is organized as fuck. And what's interesting is that this is a very, this is a proven method that we have seen in our own histories. Like I was talking about the Mongols, but then there's also the Romans. And if you make people professional soldiers and you give them each their position as a cog in a war machine, that shit works. The problem with that is that you divorce those people from their humanity by doing that. And that has its own consequence. But if you don't care about people's humanity, then this is great. And the slow build of him confiscating family members that are good at certain jobs and forcing them into this, or taking their weapons and using the best weapons for his army in particular, it becomes more and more formidable. And it culminates in, finally, he keeps trying to get his men to listen to any order that he gives without question. And his final test is that he orders them to attack Kidia, his dragon. And it's so sad. Kidia looks at him, and it says her black eyes showing surprise, anger, and then finally fear. She started to beat her wings in an attempt to take off, but Tenryo had ridden her hard that day, and she couldn't summon the strength for flight or to breathe fire. They finally go at her because he has to yell at them several times to obey his orders. And in a few minutes, she's dead. And he gathers all of the pilots, and it says ordered 1 in 5 executed as an example of the consequences of not following his orders with alacrity. The families of the executed men and women were made into slaves and distributed to the other pilots and squad leaders. Never question my orders, he said. Never. Then he knelt down before the carcass of Kidia and whispered, I'm sorry, old friend, but unless I tested them with someone I loved, they'd never be as obedient as I need them. I will carry out my promise to you and avenge you and your family. May the All-Father and his faithful servant, Peya of the winged beasts, grant you eternal rest in the silver pasture in the heavens. This is one of those moments where I'm like, I don't know how much to believe, because I don't think Tenryo loved anybody. Him saying, I had to test them with somebody I loved. I'm like, yeah, you didn't love Kidia. And also later on, he says something about basically that the gods ain't shit. So this prayer, I'm kind of like, I don't know about this, but this is part of a story, so I understand this needing to be here. Eventually, Tenryo, who again has not been treated as a favored son, gets people's attention, and they start to think maybe he deserves to take his father's place rather than one of his brothers. And these grumblings grow louder and louder until eventually he is summoned to speak to his father. And people are telling Tenryo not to go. And he's just like, it's my dad. I gotta go. But he says it in this way that he's just obviously got his own shit up his sleeve. And when he arrives, his dad is acting really weird. His father's guards and warriors are all sort of standing around and have their hands near or on their weapons in such a way as to, clearly project that he better not try anything. And Tenryo winds up attacking his father with a spear or with an axe and Garina fins. And he lights the tent on fire that has all of his brothers and sisters in it as well. And this is how he usurps his father. Then he goes and takes down the Aegon and overturns the king that had held him captive. And the king initially is like submitting the way they have always done, and thinks that he will be forced to just pay tribute the way that they have always handled this sort of thing. To which Tenryo is like, dude, I'm not going to leave you alive. I'm not going to keep doing this back and forth. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill your entire family. I will run both of these shits, and then we don't have to do this bullshit anymore ever again. That'd be great. I don't want to like eventually wake up to find your kids have grown and have a knife at my throat. I'm not going to make your mistake. And this is when he says that gods don't care about the affairs of men. Gods care about the winners. Gods care about who can manage their shit. And I can manage my shit. That's all they need to know. That's all they care to know. And then lists a bunch of like terrible things that happened and was like, where were the gods then? When all of this was happening, where were the gods? We pray to the same gods, even though we're on different sides. Who are the gods supposed to listen to in a battle when both sides are asking for that god's help? All of this, like the questions that people always ask. And ends it with crushing this guy's skull and then going down the line of all of his kneeling daughters, sons, wives, and kills all of them as well. The chieftains and their families were given to the Liuku nobles as slaves, and the Aegon common herders were forced to leave their home territories and move to the least desirable pastures close to the mountains in the east, the deserts in the south, or the ice fields to the north. And it says, but the name of Tenryo was celebrated among the Liuku. He was the greatest hero of them all, having delivered them vengeance against the hated Aegon, and he had brought them a life of relative peace and prosperity. He had understood the will of the gods better than any shaman. That was when we arrived, said Oga. So that is the end of that chapter. Oh boy, shit's popping off. I'm going to wrap up, but thank you again so much to Kyle for commissioning these. This is a fascinating read, and I kind of want to get more into like the Xiongnu. Ooh, I hope I'm saying that right. But I'm really interested in looking more into their history and finding out about this. I'm just finding it super fascinating. I hope that you guys are enjoying the coverage, and yeah, until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.